Hello and welcome to my second CraftStudio tutorial looking at the physics component. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at kinematic physics objects and how to move them around using scripts, and also how to communicate between different game objects. So we'll be looking specifically at messages. So this is my map currently, my scene, and you can see we've got several new game objects in this scene already. We've got our chest that we had before and our ball, of course, but we've also got this golden kind of object here and a doorway. The golden object is actually movable. It's a block. Let's pop down, make sure I put it back in place, and I'm using that block as a pressure plate. And we've got the door here, obviously our character can't progress to the next stage in the game until he's opened the door. And what our ball has to do is go to the chest, open the chest up, get the key, press the pressure plate, and open the door. And this is a great little example project to show how we can kind of connect a sequence of events for gameplay. And also we can examine how we can move some of these objects around, specifically the pressure plate and the door. So let's run the project and show you the example that I'm talking about. Okay, here we are. So there's our ball moving about the project. And let's just try and get through the door, just to sort of show that it's if I can do it. There we go. Solid door. Okay, so that's colliding with the physics object, physics component, and also the pressure plate as well is not active. So let's just go to my chest, bump into the chest. Oh, a key pops out, spins around once, and then it comes down here. We can see the key in our inventory, if you like, and then we should be able to push this pressure plate down. There we go, and the door opens at the same time. We can progress our character to the next level. So how did I do all that? Well, let's have a look first at the scene and find out a little bit about these new game objects. So firstly, we've got this golden pressure plate down here. And if we click it, we can see that I've added a physics component over here, and it's the kinematic physics component, and it gives us a little tooltip there which says kinematic bodies can be moved programmatically but aren't affected by forces, useful for moving obstacles. And of course this is a kind of obstacle, but I'm using it as a pressure plate. And there's our door over here as well, and again exactly the same thing, kinematic. And I've added some scripted behaviors both to the door, the key lock, the chest as well has a scripted behavior, and if we just zoom up, we've got another thing up here as well. We've got this key. Now this key appears when we collect the key from the chest down there, and it's up here because it's kind of this other shape here is another camera. It's our UI camera, and I've put two cameras in the scene, and because they're not this one's just looking at a kind of blank space. When we run the program, they both project over the top of each other, if you like. So we'll see this key appear, and this key has got a scripted behavior added to it as well. So when the game first starts, this scripted behavior turns the model renderer to transparent. So let's go through each one of these one at a time and show you how I built this project, and hopefully you'll be able to learn a little bit about how I did it and make your own games too. So first things first, what we need to do is we need to think about the ball and going to the chest. So obviously it can't interact with anything else until it's got the key. So let's go to our project home, go to our scripted behavior, and look at chest 1, which is the scripted behavior attached to the chest. Now here we have two things that we recognize from previous tutorials. We've got onAwake and we've got onUpdate, and these are two events. The onAwake event comes when the game object is sort of first brought into being, and the onUpdate is the event that repeats itself about 60 times a second, kind of checking all these things out. We've got a couple of if statements here. wondering if if these conditions have been met. So let's take a closer look at some of the onAwake event and look at some of the variables I'm creating straight away. So the first variable I'm creating is self.chestPos to global position of self-GameObject. Now, what this variable really does is it just figures out where the chest is, okay, and turns that vectored position into this variable. Useful when we're going to be checking where the chest is and where the ball is, and we're going to measure the distance between the two. The next variable is self-open_chest, and this really calls the animation, that animation that pops open the chest, pops the key out, spins it around. That's actually an animation within the model, and I'm just really calling it up here. So basically we set the value of this self-open_chest to the asset open key of type model animation. You can get that one over here in assets. The one after that we need to obviously call the model renderer. So I've called that self.model with a capital R to the component model renderer of the value of the self game object. So whatever the model renderer is of the self game object, we can change things around it using this variable here. The next two variables are self timer, and that's to a number 0, and self next, and that's also a number 0. Self timer, as you might guess, is we're going to create a little timer, and self next is I'm using as a device to stop one conditional statement and to take it to the next conditional statement, and that's why I've called it next. So let's have a little look at onUpdate. In onUpdate, what we need to do is we need to figure out where that ball is and figure if it's and work out whether it's really close to our chest. And if it was really close to our chest, almost touching the chest, then I'm going to open the chest. I'm going to run that animation, and I'm going to give the player a key, if you like. Okay, so I'm going to tell other game objects in the game that the player has the key, which will activate some of their conditional statements and allow us to push the pressure plate down and open the door. So we need to figure out where the ball is. So this set value of self ball pos to the global position of the game object named ball. What this will do is it will give us a constantly updating vector of where on earth the ball is. So that will help us in our next line of code, which is if the distance from the self chest position to the distance to the self ball position is less than 1.5 and the value of self next is 0, well it is, then we can set the value of the model renderer to play self open chest. So what this does, the distance from, if we look here, one vector, which is the chest, to the other vector, which is the ball, if it's less than this number here, so if they're really close together, so it's great for kind of almost like collisions, then we can do something. And what we're going to do is we're going to play an animation. So we're going to set the value of the self model renderer to play the animation. But we don't want that animation to keep playing, so we need to say start playback on the value of the self model renderer to loop false. And what this does is it just makes the animation play once. And then we're going to use this next variable. So then we're going to set this value of next to 1, which means that this if condition will not be met again because it wants to be 0, and we've just turned it to 1. And finally, we're going to send a message to another game object, that pressure plate called keyLock, with a little message saying I've got the key. Okay. And I'll show you how that works when I unpack the script within the keyLock. It takes a little bit of time for the model renderer to play out the animation, and what I want the animation to play out, and when the key disappears on the animation, I want the key to appear in the display, okay, in your inventory if you like. And the way I'm doing that anyway is that I start a little timer. So I use this if statement here to say, well, when that starts, this next if statement starts up, and we set the value of self timer to the value of self timer plus 1, so it starts adding itself up in the on update. And then I have another if statement, which is if the value of self timer is more than 240, send the message display key to the game object named gold key with data nothing, because we're not actually sending. We can actually send variables and stuff, other kind of information, but we don't have to send anything. We just need to send a message. And then finally, to stop this from repeating itself, I then set the value of self next to number 2. And of course there's no if conditional statements that respond to self next to, so this just sort of keeps checking, but of course it can't do anything because the self next is, we haven't got anything that really responds to that. I hope that makes sense. So that's what chest 1 does. So chest 1 is sending 2 messages. One is got key to key lock, and one is display key to gold key. Sounds complicated, but it's not. All it's doing is this chest, when the ball bumps into the chest or gets close to the chest, sends a message to the gold, to this game object over here, and it sends a message to the key up there. So let's look at what happens to this game object over here. So this one has got the scripted behavior called gold pressure plate. So here's gold pressure plate, and we've got an on awake and we've got an on update, and also we've got that message. So we've got on message got key, and you have to spell it completely right, even if you use capitals and stuff. Make sure that's totally correct. And then we can do, what I'm doing in here is I'm setting the value of self got key to true, and that refers to a variable I set up in on awake. So the 3 variables I set up in on awake, one is called self got key, and I say that's false. The next one is value of self drop, because I want the pressure plate to drop down. That's false at the moment. And I also set the value of self position, so I grab the block's position and I attach it to this variable here. So in the on update, we create a local variable, and again it doesn't have to be a local variable, but I am for this purposes. So we create a local variable called player pos with the initial value of the self position of the game object named ball. So that's tracking the ball again, because the ball needs to be very close to the pressure plate. It needs to be on top of it really. And then I say if the value of got key equals true, and that will be true if it's received this message, and the distance of the player position to the value of to the distance of the self position, which are vectors, if that's less than 1.1, then we set the value of self drop to true. And I put a little print drop there because I needed to test out this number over here, because initially it was too big, and I wasn't even getting on top of the pressure plate, and it was descending, so it looked really weird. So I put a little print thing in here so I could actually see when it started. So I reduced this number until it felt right. The next thing it does is it sets the value of self got key to false. Okay, that's so I don't get this conditional statement happening again. Okay, so it kind of stops this one, and then the other conditional statement in here is if the value of self drop equals true, then the next thing here is we need to animate that block to drop down. Okay, and I say animate because what we're actually doing is we're teleporting that self game object with the physics attached to it. We're teleporting it piece by piece, tiny little incremental movements down until it stops. And this is how we're doing it. So we set the value of self position, and then we put a dot y. And what this does, if you put a dot y, then you're breaking apart those 3 vectors. You've got x, you've got y, and you've got z. And if you put a dot x and a dot y and a dot z, you don't just have 3 numbers, you can isolate those individual numbers. So what we're doing is we're isolating the y, which is the up and down, and we're saying set the value of self pos y to itself again, but take away 0.01. Okay, so it's going to reduce slightly. and then we teleport, and it says body here, and we put this value of self game object dot physics afterwards, okay, and that really responds to the kinematic body, okay, and that's the thing that's going to move it, and we give it the vectors. We give it the x, we give it the y, and the y is the one that's changing, and we give it the z. Okay, the x and the z aren't going to really move it because we're not changing those numbers in here. Again, I put a little print teleporting so I know it's happening, so when I debug it I can find out. And then I'm going to send a couple of messages, one which is open the gate to the game object named door, and I'm also going to say used key, so send a message to use key to the game object named gold key. So that just sends a message up to the that game object at the top saying make yourself transparent again, make yourself disappear. So let's go over that again, and let's get a bit closer so you can kind of see the numbers. So here's our block up here, and what we're doing in here is this is the x position, this is the y position, and this is the z. And if we look at our script, we can see if the value of the self pos y is more than 0, and it's only slightly more than 0, it's 0.125, so it's the 125 that we're really altering. Then teleport, then take a tiny bit away and teleport to the next bit. So it takes that bit away, teleports down, and then does it all over again until the position y position equals 0. So let's have a look at what it looks like at 0. So if we push this down, we can see when it's flat against the floor, the y position is 0 up here. So that's no accident. You know, I made sure that that was going to happen. Okay, so let's lift it up again. So that's how that one's working. All right. So once it's done that, then it's going to send. This one's sending two messages again. It's one sending up to the key, and one sending to the door. So let's just have a look at the key, because obviously display gold key. There we go. So this one's had two messages sent to it, one from the chest and also one from the golden block. So that's why we've got two messages here, one which says message display key and on message used key. And again, we've got an on awake and we've got an on update. And all we're doing here is really we're changing the opacity of the model renderer from like completely transparent to display itself. Because as we know in our scene, what we could do, let's zoom up here. So we can actually we can use a slider, but also we can actually program that within this script. So we've got some variables set up here. One which is looking at the self model renderer, because we're going to have to change that. We're going to be setting the value of self display key to false, and we're going to be initially setting the opacity of the self model renderer to 0. What that does is it turns it transparent immediately as soon as the game object appears or wakes up. And then in the on the update is waiting for the value of self display key to equal true, and that's not going to be equal true until we get a message, and this is this message from the chest saying you've received this message now, and all I do is I set the value of the display key to true. That triggers the on update, which in turn triggers the next one, which is if the opacity of the self model renderer is not visible, 1. Okay, set the opacity of the self model renderer to 1. So that makes it appear, and then it just waits until this. So on the message use key, and that's when we've gone on the pressure plate, we've pushed it down, the pressure plate sends this message to this game object with set the value of display key to false and set the opacity of the self model renderer while we're at it to 0. Okay, so that makes it false. That stops this from working, and it disappears again. I hope that makes sense. Last but not least, we've also got a message from the pressure plate that's been sent to the door. So let's have a little butchers at the door. We'll go to open door, and again, very similar. They're all working exactly the same way. We've got on awake and we've got on update, and we've got an on message, which has got open gate. On the on awake, we've got two variables, one which is the self position, so again looking at its own self position, because we're going to have to move this door up along its y axis, and then also we've got to set the value of self open to false. Okay. On the update, we've got if the value of self open equals true, so again we'll have to wait for this message to be sent, which changes that to true. Then the next conditional statement is if the value of self pos y is less than 6.5, then set the value of self pos y to self pos y plus 0.1. Now, the larger that number, the faster it will go, and the smaller that number, the slower it will go. So that's really up to you, and I would definitely try and experiment with these numbers to see what happens. Okay. And then we teleport it, and again, with the teleport thing, it's really making tiny incremental movements that make it look like it's moving smoothly. So it's very much like animating an object, and we're animating an object with a script. Okay, so this teleports the value of the self game object dot physics. And you must remember that physics part, to the x position, to the y position. The y position is the one that's changing over here, and then the z. And let's have a look at that scene again, now that we know all that stuff is going on underneath. So let's press F5 and run it, and have a little look. So there's our ball, and our ball is being tracked by a couple of scripts around here. So let's bump into the chest. That runs that animation and the timer. When the timer finishes, it can display this key that's being displayed from the other camera, and then we can that chest has also sent a message to the golden pad. And if I can get on the golden pad, and again I'm just using distance to make that happen. That will in turn send a message to the door, which opens, which means I can get through. And in the next episode, we'll be going through that door. I'll be showing you how to link the camera to your player object, so we can kind of follow them along this corridor and go on to the next scene. I hope that's been helpful, and if there are any questions or comments and stuff like that, please leave them in the comments below. Subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll be releasing the CraftStudio pack for this project as well, so you can kind of open the pack yourself and take a look at all the kind of scripts that I've done there. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.